Between 2009 and 2016, the Nigerian military announced Abubakar Shekau's death at least 5 times. Each time, he reappeared in a new video, laughing at the claims, mocking world leaders, dancing with an AK-47. Intelligence analysts began to suspect the group was using body doubles. Soldiers on the ground started calling him immortal. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Shekau survived because no one who got close enough to kill him wanted the job enough to finish it. His own paranoia kept him alive. Until May 2021, when the people who finally cornered him in the Sambisa forest weren't Nigerian troops. They were his fellow jihadists. And this time, there would be no escape. Muhammad Yusuf was not supposed to be a warlord. He was a charismatic preacher who arrived in Maiduguri in 2002 with a simple message. The reason northern Nigeria was drowning in poverty and corruption was Western education and secular governance. He called Western schooling Boko, a Hausa, word meaning fake or forbidden. His followers became known as Boko Haram, though they called themselves Jama'at al-Sunnah li-Dawa wal-Jihad. Yusuf built a community that existed outside the state's legal framework. He provided small loans to the poor. He offered a sense of belonging to thousands of marginalized youths known as almajirai, children sent by rural families to cities for religious education but left to beg for food on the streets. Yusuf gave them something the government never did, a target for their rage. Maiduguri in the early 2000s was a city of contrasts. Capital of Borno State, it sat at the crossroads of trans-Saharan trade routes that had enriched the region for centuries. But by the time Yusuf arrived, those glory days were long gone. The city was overcrowded, underserviced, and teeming with young men who had no prospects. The local economy had been gutted by decades of mismanagement. Oil wealth from the south never trickled north. Politicians in Abuja treated the region as a source of votes, but not as a place deserving investment. The education system was collapsing. Healthcare was non-existent for most people. The police were corrupt. The courts were slow and inaccessible. Into this vacuum, Yusuf stepped with a message that was both radical and obvious. The system was broken, and the people who ran it were to blame. Yusuf's compound in the railway quarters section of Maiduguri became a magnet for the dispossessed. He built a mosque and a school. He offered food and shelter. He preached a theology that was heavily influenced by Salafist thought, emphasizing a return to what he considered the pure Islam of the Prophet Muhammad's time. He rejected democracy as un-Islamic. He condemned Nigerian politicians as puppets of the West. He argued that Muslims should live under Sharia law, not secular constitutions written by colonizers and their local collaborators. For young men who had been failed by every institution in their lives, this message resonated. The early movement was not yet a killing machine. It was a reformist sect that attracted people who had been abandoned by the system. Yusuf did not initially call for armed jihad. He called for a transformation of society through religious awakening. He wanted Muslims to withdraw from participation in what he saw as a corrupt state and build parallel institutions based on Islamic principles. His followers established farms, businesses, and informal courts. They created a world within a world, a shadow society that operated according to different rules. But the Nigerian state could not tolerate a parallel authority. Local politicians saw Yusuf as a threat. Police saw his compound as a haven for criminals. In 2009, tensions reached a breaking point. The exact sequence of events is disputed, but most accounts agree that a clash between Yusuf's followers and police over a minor traffic dispute spiraled out of control. What began as a confrontation at a checkpoint escalated into a full uprising. Yusuf's followers attacked police stations and government buildings. They burned churches. They killed dozens of people. The Nigerian military responded with overwhelming force. Soldiers moved through Maiduguri neighborhood by neighborhood, hunting Yusuf's followers. More than 700 people were killed in the crackdown. Yusuf's compound was destroyed. Yusuf himself went into hiding but was captured within days. He was handed over to police. Hours later, he was dead. The official story was that he was killed while trying to escape. The reality, visible in leaked video footage, was that he was executed in custody. His interrogation was filmed. He was asked questions while sitting on the ground, hands bound. Then, off camera, shots were heard. When the camera panned back, Yusuf was dead. The footage of his interrogation and death spread across the region. It was meant to demonstrate the state's power. Instead, it created a martyr. The reformist phase ended that night. The insurgent phase began under his second-in-command, Abubakar Shekau. Abubakar Shekau was born in Shekau village in Yobe State sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s. The exact date is uncertain. He was educated in the religious schools of Maiduguri, the same institutions that produced thousands of other young men with deep knowledge of Islamic texts, but no practical skills for navigating the modern economy. He joined Yusuf's movement early and quickly became Yusuf's deputy. But the two men could not have been more different. Where Yusuf was a community builder, Shekau was a destroyer. Where Yusuf tried to win hearts, Shekau demanded submission. Where Yusuf preached revolution through awakening, Shekau preached revolution through annihilation. After Yusuf's death, Shekau went underground. For months, no one knew if he had survived the crackdown. Then, in July 2010, he appeared in a video. He was dressed in military fatigues, surrounded by armed fighters. He claimed leadership of the group and vowed revenge for Yusuf's execution. He declared that the Nigerian state would pay in blood for what it had done, and he delivered on that promise. Shekau rebuilt the group in his own image. He adopted the nickname Darul Tawheed, meaning the abode of monotheism, suggesting a scholarly focus on the oneness of God. But his actual tenure was defined by takfir, the practice of excommunicating and slaughtering any Muslim who did not join his specific jihad. He declared ordinary Muslims who worked for the government, sent their children to state schools, or voted in elections to be apostates deserving of death. This was not mainstream Islamic theology. It was a fringe position rejected by the vast majority of scholars. But for Shekau, it was the foundation of his authority. If anyone could be declared an apostate, then anyone could be killed. And if anyone could be killed, then Shekau's power was unlimited. Shekau's personality was a blend of extreme piety and clinical paranoia. According to reports from within the group, the death of his first wife in childbirth triggered a psychological crisis so severe that his own followers chained him up at times to prevent him from committing irrational acts of violence. He was known to execute commanders on suspicion alone, without trial or evidence. He saw betrayal everywhere. He trusted no one. He centralized all financial decisions, refusing to delegate authority even when it crippled operations. His fighters often went months without pay or supplies because Shekau hoarded the group's weapon caches and cash reserves with such secrecy that even senior commanders didn't know where they were stored. This paranoia was not entirely irrational. The group was riddled with informants. The Nigerian military had successfully infiltrated cells in the past. And in an organization built on violence and fear, loyalty was always conditional. But Shekau's response to the threat of betrayal was to create conditions that guaranteed it. By refusing to pay fighters, by executing commanders arbitrarily, by keeping everyone in the dark about strategy and resources, he ensured that resentment festered. The question was not whether people would betray him. The question was when. But Shekau understood the power of media. He appeared in videos wearing camouflaged fatigues, flanked by masked gunmen wielding an AK-47. He ranted against Western leaders like Barack Obama and Francois Hollande. He mocked the Nigerian military, calling them cowards and apostates. His media persona was intentionally uncontrollable. He would laugh hysterically, dance erratically, and use caustic humor to demean his enemies. In one infamous video, he appeared shirtless, ranting at the camera. In another, he fired an AK-47 into the air while screaming. These performances were not accidents. They were calculated to project an image of a man who was beyond reason, beyond negotiation, beyond the normal rules of warfare. This representation served two purposes. First, it intimidated the Nigerian public. Shekau became the face of terror, a bogeyman whose name was enough to empty villages. Second, it demoralized soldiers who began to view him as something supernatural. When the military announced his death and he reappeared days later, it reinforced the myth. Intelligence agencies now believe the group may have used lookalikes, including a fighter named Bashir Muhammad, to impersonate Shekau in videos after he was wounded in battles in 2009 and 2013. The use of body doubles was not new in the world of insurgency, but Boko Haram executed it with particular skill. The man who appeared in videos after 2013 had subtle differences in appearance, voice, and mannerisms. But the Nigerian military and media failed to notice or chose not to mention these discrepancies. Each false report of his death became a propaganda victory, allowing the group to portray the state as a source of infidel lies. Shekau's theological education, though deep, was narrow. He could recite verses from the Quran and Hadith from memory. He could engage in detailed arguments about points of Islamic jurisprudence. But his worldview had no room for nuance, compromise, or mercy. Islam, as he understood it, was a religion of absolutes. You were either with him or against him. There was no middle ground. This binary thinking extended to his understanding of violence. Killing was not a regrettable necessity, it was a form of worship. Every attack was an act of devotion. Every victim was a sacrifice to God's will. This theology of annihilation would eventually alienate even his fellow jihadists, but in the early years, it gave him a clarity of purpose that his enemies lacked. In July 2010, Shekau released his first video as leader. He vowed revenge for Yusuf's execution. The group's transformation into a full insurgency began immediately. The early attacks were relatively small scale. Drive-by shootings of police officers, assassinations of local officials, bombings of beer parlors and Christian churches. But the pace and intensity escalated rapidly. In June 2011, Boko Haram carried out its first suicide bombing, targeting the police headquarters in Abuja. The bomber drove a car packed with explosives through the front gate and detonated it in the compound. Several people were killed, dozens wounded. The attack signaled a shift in capability and ambition. 3 months later, in August 2011, they bombed the United Nations headquarters in Abuja. A suicide bomber drove a vehicle loaded with explosives through the security barriers and detonated it at the base of the building. The explosion was massive, collapsing sections of the structure and killing 23 people. The UN bombing shocked the international community. Abuja was supposed to be secure. The UN compound was supposed to be protected. The attack demonstrated that Boko Haram could strike anywhere, at any time, despite the government's assurances of security. Shekau was no longer leading a local sect. He was commanding a transnational terrorist organization with the capability to carry out sophisticated attacks in major cities. The question was where he had acquired this capability. The answer lay in connections forged during the group's early years. Several key members of Boko Haram had trained with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in the Sahara. They had learned bomb-making, tactical planning, and the art of propaganda. They had brought these skills back to Nigeria and were now applying them under Shekau's direction. The group's primary recruitment pool remained the Almajiri system. Millions of children in northern Nigeria are sent to religious schools without parental supervision or state support. These children, some as young as 5 or 6, are expected to memorize the Quran while begging for food on the streets. The system has ancient roots, dating back centuries to when such schools were centers of Islamic scholarship and community support. But in modern Nigeria, the system has collapsed into a form of child abandonment. Parents who cannot afford to feed their children send them away with the vague hope that they will receive an education. Instead, they receive neglect. These children are highly susceptible to narratives offered by charismatic leaders who provide them with food, shelter, and a sense of purpose. Boko Haram offered all three, but the movement also attracted a different kind of recruit: men with grievances against the Nigerian state, unemployed youths with no economic prospects, and fighters from neighboring countries drawn by the promise of war booty and adventure. The group became a magnet for those who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from the collapse of the existing order. By 2012, internal tensions were already visible. A faction led by commanders with ties to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb broke away to form Ansaru. They criticized Shekau's indiscriminate killing of Muslims and argued for a more strategic approach that focused on Western and government targets. Ansaru's founding statement explicitly condemned attacks on Muslim civilians, calling them violations of Islamic law. They wanted to position themselves as defenders of Muslims against Western aggression, not as killers of their fellow believers. But Ansaru never gained the traction that Boko Haram did. They carried out several high-profile operations, including the kidnapping of foreign workers from construction sites in northern Nigeria. But they lacked Shekau's ruthlessness and his willingness to use extreme violence to maintain control. Within a few years, Ansaru had been largely absorbed back into Boko Haram or eliminated by Nigerian security forces. Shekau's model of total war, however chaotic, proved effective in the short term. His fighters could strike anywhere, anytime, and melt back into the civilian population or retreat into the vast, ungoverned spaces of northeastern Nigeria. The attacks continued to escalate. Markets were bombed during peak hours. Churches were attacked during services. Bus stations were targeted when they were crowded with travelers. The goal was not to achieve a specific tactical objective. The goal was to create an atmosphere of pervasive fear where no one felt safe anywhere. Shekau wanted to demonstrate that the Nigerian state could not protect its citizens, that the government's promises of security were hollow, and that the only power that mattered was his. On the night of April 14, 2014, Boko Haram fighters raided the government secondary school in Chibok, a town in Borno State. They abducted 276 schoolgirls who were preparing for exams. The kidnapping triggered a global outcry. The hashtag #BringBackOurGirls trended worldwide. World leaders condemned the attack. Michelle Obama held up a sign with the hashtag. Protests erupted in major cities around the world. The Nigerian government, embarrassed by the international attention, promised swift action, but weeks passed with no rescue attempt. Shekau let the world wait. Then, in early May, he released a video. He appeared on camera laughing as he admitted responsibility. He said the girls would be sold as slaves or married off to his fighters. He mocked their parents for sending them to Western schools. He declared that education for women was un-Islamic and that the girls deserved their fate. The video was designed to humiliate the Nigerian government and demonstrate his absolute control. It worked. The government's response was confused and ineffective. Officials gave conflicting statements about whether they knew where the girls were being held and whether negotiations were underway. The Chibok kidnapping marked the peak of Shekau's power. It demonstrated that he could strike at will, that he could hold hundreds of captives without fear of rescue, and that he could manipulate global media to spread his message. In the aftermath of Chibok, Boko Haram accelerated its territorial expansion. Towns across northeastern Nigeria fell to the insurgents. The Nigerian military, demoralized and poorly equipped, retreated. In August 2014, Shekau's forces captured Gwoza, a strategic town in the Mandara Mountains near the Cameroon border. Gwoza sits at the base of a mountain pass that controls access between Nigeria and Cameroon. Controlling Gwoza meant controlling trade, movement, and strategic depth. Shekau understood this. He entered the town and declared an Islamic caliphate. He stood in the town square, surrounded by fighters and captives, and announced that he was now ruling under Sharia law. He dismissed the local emirs and replaced them with his own commanders, known as Qaids. The establishment of the caliphate was not just symbolic. The group imposed a rigid interpretation of Sharia law across the territory it controlled. Public executions became routine. Thieves had their hands amputated. Adulterers were stoned. Anyone caught smoking or drinking alcohol was flogged. Markets were segregated by gender. Women were required to wear full-body coverings. Music was banned. Television was banned. Anyone caught with a mobile phone was suspected of being a spy and could be executed. The system was designed to create total control through total fear. At its height, the so-called caliphate controlled territory the size of Belgium. The group's headquarters was in Gwoza, but its operational heart was the Sambisa Forest, a 60,000 square kilometer expanse of dense canopy and uncharted terrain. The forest had once been a colonial-era game reserve established by the British to protect elephants and other wildlife. After independence, it had been largely abandoned, used occasionally by hunters and herders, but otherwise left wild. Now it was a sprawling jihadist base containing training camps, hospitals, underground bunkers, and housing for thousands of captives. Shekau's command center was located in the forest's core, protected by layers of minefields and mobile technical units mounted with anti-aircraft guns and heavy machine guns. The Nigerian military's heavy armor was useless in the forest. Tanks and armored personnel carriers couldn't navigate the terrain. Roads were few and easily mined. Airstrikes were ineffective because the canopy obscured targets and because the fighters had learned to disperse during the day and concentrate only at night. The Sambisa became Shekau's private domain, a place where he could rule without interference, where his word was absolute law, where he could indulge his paranoia and his appetite for violence without constraint. Inside the Sambisa, Shekau established a miniature state. There were training camps where new recruits learned to fire weapons and build improvised explosive devices. There were hospitals where wounded fighters received basic medical care. There were prisons where captives were held. There were housing areas where the fighters' families lived. There were even farms where food was grown to supplement what was stolen in raids. The infrastructure was crude, but it was functional. Shekau had created a world that operated according to his rules, isolated from the rest of Nigeria, insulated from the state's power. Shekau's model of governance was not sustainable. Unlike other jihadist groups that established systems of taxation and governance, attempting to build some form of legitimacy and popular support, Shekau's faction operated what researchers call a plunder-based economy. His fighters relied on the immediate acquisition of war booty, known in Islamic jurisprudence as ghanima. This included the theft of livestock, the raiding of markets, and the kidnapping of civilians for ransom or forced labor. The spoils were divided among fighters according to traditional formulas, with Shekau taking the largest share. There was no long-term planning, no infrastructure development, no attempt to build a social contract with the population under his control. The plunder economy had several consequences. First, it made the group dependent on constant military action. If fighters weren't attacking, they weren't earning. This created pressure to launch raids even when strategic considerations might have counseled caution. Second, it made the group's relationship with local populations purely predatory. Villages under Boko Haram control were not governed, they were farmed. Third, it created internal tensions because the distribution of loot was often arbitrary, and because fighters who participated in successful raids were enriched, while those who didn't went without. In January 2015, Boko Haram forces attacked the town of Baga and the nearby fishing hub of Doran Baga on the shores of Lake Chad. The attack came at a moment of maximum vulnerability for the town. Nigerian military forces that had been stationed there were in the process of being reorganized under the command of the Multinational Joint Task Force, a regional military coalition that included troops from Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. During this transition, defenses were weak. Boko Haram exploited the gap. The attack on Baga was methodical and brutal. Fighters entered the town in the early morning, moving from house to house. Anyone who resisted was killed immediately. Anyone who fled was chased down. By some accounts, the killing continued for days. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly. The Nigerian military initially claimed that only about 150 people had died. Local officials and Amnesty International suggested the number could be as high as 2,000. The discrepancy is explained by the difficulty of conducting a proper accounting in the aftermath. Many bodies were burned, others were thrown into Lake Chad. Families fled before they could report missing members. The area was too dangerous for journalists or humanitarian workers to access for weeks. Satellite images analyzed by Amnesty International showed widespread destruction. Entire neighborhoods were razed. More than 3,700 structures were damaged or destroyed. The images showed a level of devastation consistent with a large-scale massacre, but without access to the site immediately after the attack, precision was elusive. Survivors described having to step over corpses for 5 kilometers as they fled toward Maiduguri. They spoke of the smell, the flies, the horror of walking through streets lined with bodies. The massacre at Baga was not a military operation in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of terror. Shekau wanted to send a message. No one was safe. No place was beyond his reach. No amount of military presence could protect you. But the Baga massacre also revealed the limits of Shekau's strategy. The town was a major fish market, a key node in the Lake Chad trade network that connected Nigeria to Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. By destroying it, Shekau eliminated a source of revenue that could have been taxed. He alienated the local population that might have supported or tolerated the group out of fear or economic necessity. His forces looted what they could carry, loaded fish, grain, and livestock onto trucks, and burned the rest. There was no attempt to hold the territory or govern it. This pattern repeated across dozens of towns and villages. Shekau's empire was not built to last. It was built to consume. The conflict unfolded against the backdrop of a slow-motion environmental catastrophe. Lake Chad, which once covered about 25,000 square kilometers and provided a lifeline for 30 million people across Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, has fluctuated dramatically over the past 50 years. In the 1960s, the lake was one of Africa's largest bodies of fresh water. By the early 2000s, it had shrunk to about 10% of its historical size. The causes are complex: drought cycles driven by climate variability, upstream water diversion for irrigation projects, and changing rainfall patterns. The result has been the collapse of local fisheries and agriculture. Entire communities that depended on fishing and farming have been displaced. Villages that once sat on the lake shore are now dozens of kilometers from water. Fishing communities have seen their catches decline precipitously. Farmers who relied on the lake's seasonal flooding to irrigate their fields have watched their crops fail. Herders who brought their cattle to the lake during the dry season have had to travel farther and farther to find water and grazing land. The ecological collapse has created a massive pool of displaced, desperate people with no economic options. Jihadist groups, including Boko Haram, stepped into the vacuum left by the state. In areas where they exercised control, they provided food aid to those who cooperated. They regulated access to fishing grounds and grazing lands. They imposed taxes but also offered protection from bandits and rival groups. For communities that had seen no meaningful government presence in years, the insurgents offered a form of governance, however brutal. For those who resisted, the consequences were swift and deadly. The lake's islands, characterized by floating masses of vegetation known as kirtas, became strategic assets for the insurgency. These islands shift and change with the seasons. Channels that are navigable one month may be blocked the next. Only people with intimate knowledge of the lake can navigate it effectively. Boko Haram recruited extensively from fishing communities, gaining both fighters and guides who understood the lake's geography. The islands served as hideouts, training camps, and smuggling hubs. Fighters could move seamlessly across international borders, appearing in Nigeria one day and Niger or Chad the next. The lake's geography made it nearly impossible for national militaries to coordinate effective operations. Each country focused on its own borders, treating the insurgency as primarily a national problem. But the insurgents recognized no borders. They moved fluidly across the lake, striking targets on one side and retreating to sanctuaries on the other. The multinational Joint Task Force was supposed to address this problem through regional coordination, but in practice, the force was hampered by lack of resources, poor communication between national contingents, and political rivalries between member states. Climate change did not cause the insurgency, but it created conditions that made recruitment easier and governance harder. When the state cannot provide security or economic opportunity, extremist groups offer an alternative. For young men with no prospects, joining Boko Haram meant access to weapons, status, and a share of the spoils. For communities caught in the crossfire, cooperation with the insurgents was often a matter of survival. The environmental crisis and the security crisis fed into each other, creating a cycle that has proven nearly impossible to break. In March 2015, at the height of his power, Shekau made a calculated move. He released a video in which he pledged allegiance to Abubakar al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed caliph of the Islamic State. Shekau declared that his fighters were now part of the global caliphate, and that their struggle in West Africa was connected to the broader jihadist project in Syria, Iraq, and beyond. The group was renamed the Islamic State's West Africa Province, or ISWAP. The pledge was designed to elevate Boko Haram's status on the global jihadist stage. By aligning with ISIS, Shekau hoped to attract foreign fighters, secure funding from donors in the Gulf, and gain access to ISIS's sophisticated propaganda apparatus. For a brief moment, it worked. The group's videos became slicker, produced in the distinctive style of ISIS media releases. The attacks became more sophisticated, incorporating tactics that ISIS had pioneered in Syria and Iraq. Foreign fighters began to trickle in, including some with combat experience in Middle Eastern theaters. But the alliance was fragile from the start. ISIS Central Command in Syria and Iraq expected its affiliates to follow a specific model of governance. They wanted a bureaucratic caliphate that could provide services, collect taxes, and maintain order. They believed that the key to long-term survival was building popular support, or at least acquiescence, among the populations they controlled. ISIS in Iraq and Syria ran schools, hospitals, and courts. They regulated markets and provided basic services. Their brutality was real, but it was selective and served strategic purposes. Shekau's chaotic, predatory model clashed fundamentally with this vision. He had no interest in building institutions or winning popular support. His approach was purely extractive and destructive. He continued to attack mosques and markets. He continued to kill Muslim civilians who refused to join him. He continued to operate with a level of arbitrary brutality that made governance impossible. ISIS Central Command grew increasingly frustrated. Tensions within the group escalated. Maman Noor, an experienced strategist with links to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, had served as a check on Shekau's most erratic impulses in the early years. Noor was pragmatic where Shekau was ideological. He understood that pure terror was not a sustainable strategy, that the group needed to build relationships with local communities if it hoped to survive. But Shekau viewed pragmatism as weakness and compromise as betrayal. By 2016, the ideological distance between the factions had become insurmountable. In August 2016, ISIS Central Command made an unprecedented decision. They removed Shekau as leader of ISWAP and replaced him with Abu Musab al-Barnawi, the son of Muhammad Yusuf. The announcement came in the form of an article published in ISIS's weekly newsletter, Al-Naba. The article did not explicitly name Shekau, but made clear that there had been a leadership change. Al-Barnawi, acting as the group's new spokesman, issued a public statement explaining the split. He challenged Shekau's legitimacy by arguing that the targeting of ordinary Muslims was a religious sacrilege. He accused Shekau of killing more Muslims than infidels, of destroying mosques, of burning Qurans found in the homes of people he had declared apostates. He pointed out that Islamic law, even in its most conservative interpretations, places strict limits on who can be killed and under what circumstances. Shekau, he argued, had violated these limits systematically. He had placed his own judgment above the consensus of Islamic scholars. He had turned jihad into a tool of personal power rather than a service to God. Al-Barnawi promised a new model of jihad. ISWAP would focus on military and government targets. It would avoid harming Muslim civilians. It would attempt to build a social contract with local populations, providing services and protection in exchange for cooperation. It would operate according to bureaucratic procedures rather than one man's whims. The message was clear. Shekau's reign of chaos was over. A new, more disciplined phase was beginning. Shekau refused to accept the decision. He released his own video denouncing al-Barnawi as a traitor and a puppet. He reverted to using the group's original name, Jama'atu al-Sunnah Lida Awadi wal Jihad, or JES. He claimed that he remained the true leader of the jihadist movement in West Africa and that ISIS Central Command had been deceived by his enemies. He vowed to continue fighting according to his own interpretation of Islamic law, regardless of what ISIS or anyone else said. The split was not merely ideological or personal. It represented a fundamental disagreement about the nature of jihad in the 21st century. Was it a tool of state building or a weapon of apocalyptic destruction? Could an insurgency survive by terrorizing the population it sought to control, or did it need to offer something in return for compliance? These were not abstract questions. They determined how resources were allocated, how operations were planned, and ultimately who lived and who died. The split created two distinct organizations with fundamentally different approaches to insurgency. ISWAP, under al-Barnawi and later under commanders like Boko Gorgore, established a system of taxation on trade and agriculture. They set up checkpoints on roads and waterways where traders were required to pay fees. They regulated fishing on Lake Chad, requiring fishermen to obtain permits and pay levies on their catches. They collected taxes on market transactions, functioning much like a state that happened to be at war with other states. The revenues from these activities were substantial. Lake Chad's fish trade alone was worth millions of dollars annually before the conflict. Control over even a fraction of that trade provided ISWAP with a steady income stream. They used these funds to pay their fighters monthly stipends, a practice that created discipline and loyalty. Fighters who knew they would be paid regularly were less likely to engage in freelance looting or to defect. They were more likely to follow orders and to think of themselves as soldiers in an army rather than bandits in a gang. ISWAP also invested in infrastructure. They maintained roads and bridges in areas they controlled. They dug wells and built irrigation systems. They established courts where disputes could be resolved. They ran schools where children were taught to read and memorize the Quran. These services were not provided out of altruism. They were tools of governance designed to create legitimacy and extract cooperation. But they were real, and for populations that had seen little from the Nigerian state, they mattered. The group maintained a disciplined command structure overseen by a Shura council. The council included religious scholars who provided guidance on theological questions, military commanders who planned operations, and administrators who managed finances and logistics. Decisions were made through debate and consensus. While al-Barnawi and later leaders had significant authority, they were not absolute dictators. They could be challenged and overruled by the council. This structure created stability and adaptability. ISWAP avoided attacking mosques and markets unless there was a clear military target. When they did launch attacks, they issued statements explaining their rationale. They presented themselves as an alternative government engaged in a legitimate war against an illegitimate state, not as terrorists attacking civilians. This narrative had some resonance, particularly in areas where the Nigerian military had committed abuses against local populations in the name of counterinsurgency. Shekau's JAS faction, by contrast, continued to operate on the plunder model. They raided villages, stole livestock, and kidnapped civilians. Fighters were paid in immediate shares of war booty, a system known in Arabic as ghanima. The spoils of each raid were divided according to Islamic formulas, with the leader taking a fifth and the rest distributed among the participants. Women and girls captured in raids were classified as war captives and distributed as slaves, a practice that Shekau justified through selective readings of medieval Islamic legal texts. There was no pretense of governance, no attempt to win hearts and minds, no investment in infrastructure or services. JAS controlled territory not by providing benefits, but by inspiring fear. Villages in JAS areas lived in constant terror of the next raid. Farmers were forced to hand over portions of their harvests. Herders had their cattle seized. Young men were conscripted. Young women were abducted. Those who resisted were killed, often in ways designed to terrorize. Public beheadings, crucifixions, burnings. Shekau remained an absolute autocrat who bypassed any consultation and managed finances with such secrecy that his own commanders were kept in the dark. He controlled the group's weapon stockpiles personally, storing them in hidden caches that only he knew the locations of. When fighters needed ammunition or explosives, they had to request them from Shekau, who would approve or deny the request based on criteria that were never made clear. This system prevented anyone from accumulating enough military power to challenge him. But it also meant that operations were often under-resourced and that fighters went into battle without adequate supplies. The procedural differences between the two groups were stark. ISWAP meetings involved debate and consensus building. Commanders presented plans, scholars raised theological concerns, and decisions emerged from discussion. JAS meetings, to the extent they happened at all, involved Shekau issuing orders and executing those who questioned him. Shekau's paranoia had reached such extremes that he sometimes killed commanders simply for being too popular with their troops, fearing that popularity might translate into a coup attempt. The tactical innovations of the Shekau era became institutionalized procedures. Between 2014 and 2017, JAS deployed hundreds of female suicide bombers, some as young as 10 years old. This was both a tactical choice and a psychological weapon. In northern Nigerian culture, women and girls were generally not seen as military threats. Security forces at checkpoints and markets were less vigilant when searching women. This created an exploitable vulnerability. By using female bombers, JAS could penetrate security perimeters that would have stopped male attackers. The practice also served psychological purposes. The sight of a woman or child detonating a vest in a crowded market created a level of horror that conventional attacks could not match. It violated deep cultural norms around the protection of women and children. It forced security services to treat every woman as a potential threat, creating friction between the state and the population it was supposed to protect. Women going to market were subjected to humiliating searches. This built resentment against the government and played into JAS's narrative that the state was at war with Islam and Muslim communities. The bombers themselves were often captives taken in raids. They were held in camps where they were subjected to intense indoctrination. They were told that martyrdom was the only way to cleanse themselves of the shame of having been captured by jihadists, that their families would be honored, that paradise awaited them. Some were likely coerced through threats against their families. Others may have been drugged or deceived about the nature of their mission. The full truth is difficult to establish because the bombers died in their attacks and survivors of the camps are often too traumatized to speak. By 2018, the conflict in northeastern Nigeria had evolved into a three-way war. The Nigerian military was fighting both JAS and ISWAP, but JS and ISWAP were also fighting each other, often with greater intensity than they fought the state. The jihadist civil war consumed resources, attention, and lives. It reshaped the geography of the conflict and determined which group would dominate which territories. ISWAP began a systematic campaign to eliminate JAS commanders and absorb their fighters. They targeted supply lines, ambushed convoys traveling between JAS camps, and assassinated key leaders. They sent emissaries to JAS units offering generous terms for defection, forgiveness for past actions, regular pay, better treatment, a role in a more sustainable and successful organization. Many fighters accepted. They were tired of not being paid. They were tired of the arbitrary executions. They were tired of Shekau's paranoia and unpredictability. They saw ISWAP as a more professional operation with better prospects for survival and success. Shekau responded with characteristic brutality. He ordered the execution of anyone suspected of communicating with ISWAP. He sent assassins to hunt down fighters who had defected. He launched retaliatory raids against ISWAP positions, prioritizing targets that would hurt ISWAP's reputation with local communities, such as attacking markets that ISWAP had promised to protect. The spiral of violence between the two groups intensified month by month. The geographical division reflected the ideological split. ISWAP dominated the islands of Lake Chad and the areas around Bama, Konduga, and Damboa, a region known as the Timbuktu Triangle. These were areas with functioning economies where ISWAP's taxation model could generate revenue. They were also areas with dense populations where governance and service provision mattered. ISWAP's approach was better suited to these environments. JS controlled the Sambisa Forest and parts of the Mandara Mountains along the Cameroon border. These were remote, sparsely populated areas where the plunder economy could still function. The forest provided cover and defensive depth. The mountains provided strategic vantage points and escape routes into Cameroon when Nigerian forces launched operations. But these areas were also increasingly isolated. As ISWAP expanded, JAS's territory shrank. Shekau found himself ruling over an ever smaller domain. The Sambisa remained Shekau's fortress, but it was also his prison. He could not venture out without risking assassination by ISWAP or capture by the military. His movements became increasingly restricted. He spent weeks or months in his bunker, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists. His communications with the outside world grew sporadic. Videos that he released were analyzed for clues about his location and state of mind. Intelligence agencies noted that he appeared thinner, more haggard, more unhinged. The man who had once terrorized West Africa was now trapped in a forest, surrounded by enemies, running out of options. ISWAP's disciplined approach began to pay dividends beyond territorial control. They attracted defectors not just from JS, but also from other armed groups operating in the region. Bandits and militias that had been operating independently saw advantages in aligning with ISWAP. The group's reputation for competence and its ability to provide security and resources made it an attractive partner. ISWAP was becoming the dominant jihadist organization in the Lake Chad Basin. They built relationships with local communities by providing services and avoiding the indiscriminate violence that defined the Shekau years. They punished fighters who looted or assaulted civilians without authorization. They established dispute resolution mechanisms that were seen as fairer than the corrupt or inaccessible state courts. They presented themselves as a government in waiting, an organization that could take over when the Nigerian state finally collapsed. This narrative had resonance in areas where the state had long been absent or predatory. The Nigerian government struggled to respond effectively because the two groups required different counterinsurgency approaches. What worked against JS did not work against ISWAP, and vice versa. JAS could be degraded through aggressive military operations because it had no deep roots in local communities. ISWAP, with its service provision and governance structures, required a more sophisticated approach that combined military pressure with efforts to address the underlying grievances that made communities receptive to insurgent governance. The Nigerian military, trained for conventional warfare and handicapped by corruption and poor morale, was ill-equipped for either task. In early 2021, ISWAP leadership made a decision. Shekau had to go. His continued existence was an embarrassment to the global jihadist movement. His faction was bleeding fighters to ISWAP defections. His unpredictability made him a liability in negotiations with local communities and in the management of cross-border smuggling routes. Most importantly, his claim to represent legitimate jihad in West Africa undermined ISWAP's own legitimacy. As long as Shekau was alive, the two groups would compete for the same pool of recruits, the same sources of funding, the same narrative space. The competition benefited neither group. It had to end. ISWAP commanders, possibly with approval from ISIS Central Command in Syria or Iraq, authorized a special operation to capture or kill Shekau and dismantle his base in the Sambisa forest. The operation was planned meticulously. ISWAP had been infiltrating JS for months, recruiting spies, gathering intelligence, mapping defenses. They knew the locations of Shekau's camps. They knew the routes he used to move between them. They knew which commanders were loyal to him and which might be persuaded to defect. The operation began with intelligence gathering and psychological warfare. ISWAP sent messages to JS fighters offering amnesty and rewards for defection. They dropped leaflets in areas controlled by JS promising better treatment and regular pay. They spread rumors that Shekau had been abandoned by God, that his defeats were divine punishment for his violations of Islamic law. These efforts had an effect. Several key JAS commanders made contact with ISWAP and agreed to provide information in exchange for protection and positions in the ISWAP hierarchy. These defectors provided the exact coordinates of Shekau's bunker and the locations of minefields protecting his position. They drew maps showing the layout of the camps, the numbers of fighters in each location, and the routes that connected them. They identified the commanders who were most loyal to Shekau and those who might be wavering. This intelligence was invaluable. It transformed what could have been a bloody, protracted campaign into a surgical operation. In May 2021, ISWAP launched a coordinated invasion of the Sambisa forest, using mobile columns of fighters who were intimately familiar with the terrain. Unlike the Nigerian military, which relied on heavy vehicles and struggled with the forest's narrow paths and dense vegetation, ISWAP fighters moved on foot and on motorcycles. They were local men, many of them former JAS fighters who knew the forest intimately. They navigated the terrain with ease, avoiding minefields and ambush sites. The invasion began with simultaneous strikes on 4 minor JAS camps scattered around the forest's perimeter. These strikes were designed to create confusion and to cut off potential escape routes. Each camp was hit at dawn by overwhelming force. The defenders, outnumbered and caught by surprise, had little choice but to surrender or flee. Most chose surrender. They were disarmed, questioned, and given the option to join ISWAP or return to their villages. Many chose to join. Others simply wanted to go home. With the outer camp secured, ISWAP forces converged on Shekau's main base in the heart of the forest. The advance was methodical. They moved slowly, clearing paths, disarming mines, and establishing secure positions. They brought in reinforcements and supplies, preparing for a siege if necessary. By May 14th, they had breached the outer defenses of Shekau's camp. His fighters, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to surrender or flee. The defections accelerated. Entire units laid down their weapons and crossed over to ISWAP lines. Shekau himself retreated to his bunker with a small group of hardcore loyalists. These were men who had been with him for years, who had committed atrocities in his name, who knew that ISWAP or the Nigerian government would never forgive them. They had nothing to gain from surrender. They prepared to fight to the death. But ISWAP had no interest in martyring Shekau. They wanted him alive, humiliated, forced to renounce his leadership in a video that would be broadcast across the region. Over the next several days, ISWAP tightened the noose. They blocked all escape routes. They cut off supply lines. They positioned snipers to prevent anyone from leaving the bunker. They waited. Inside the bunker, conditions deteriorated. Food ran out, water was rationed. The defenders knew that rescue was not coming. They knew that the Nigerian military, even if it wanted to intervene, could not reach them in time. They were on their own. On May 19, 2021, ISWAP commanders approached Shekau's bunker under a flag of truce. They called out requesting negotiations. After a tense standoff, Shekau agreed to talk. The negotiations lasted several hours. The details of what was said remain unclear, reconstructed from accounts given by surviving fighters on both sides. But the broad outlines are known. ISWAP's demands were clear. They wanted Shekau to surrender. They wanted him to appear in a video renouncing his leadership and acknowledging that he had violated Islamic law in his conduct of jihad. They wanted him to order his remaining fighters to lay down their weapons and join ISWAP. In exchange, they promised to spare his life. They promised that he would not be handed over to the Nigerian government. They promised that he could live out his days in a remote location under ISWAP supervision. It was, by any measure, a generous offer. Shekau had killed hundreds of ISWAP fighters in the years since the split. He had undermined ISWAP's efforts at governance. He had given global jihadism a bad name with his indiscriminate brutality. ISWAP had every reason to want him dead. But they also recognized that a captured, humiliated Shekau was worth more than a martyred one. A video of Shekau admitting defeat would be a propaganda victory that would cement ISWAP's dominance and attract defectors from the remaining JAS units across the region. But Shekau was not a man who surrendered. He had built his entire identity around the idea that he was God's chosen instrument, that his interpretation of Islam was the only correct one, that compromise was betrayal. To surrender would be to admit that everything he had done, everyone he had killed, every village he had burned, had been for nothing. It would be to acknowledge that his rivals had been right all along. For a man of Shekau's psychology, this was unthinkable. In a final audio recording made on May 18th, one day before his death, Shekau addressed his remaining followers. His voice was calm, almost resigned. He acknowledged the betrayal of his commanders. He admitted that many of his fighters had defected to ISWAP. He expressed no surprise at this. He had always known, he said, that the path of true jihad was lonely, that most men lacked the courage to follow it to the end. He spoke of his certainty that he was right, that history would vindicate him, that God would reward his steadfastness. He vowed never to pledge allegiance to al-Barnawi or anyone else. He framed his refusal as a matter of religious principle. He argued that al-Barnawi and ISWAP had compromised the purity of jihad by seeking to build relationships with populations that included apostates and hypocrites. He claimed that his own uncompromising approach, however costly, was the only one faithful to the example of the Prophet Muhammad. He ended the recording with prayers and Quranic verses. The tone was not defiant. It was elegiac, the voice of a man who knew he was about to die and was making peace with it. The recording was distributed to his remaining loyalists in the bunker and to a few trusted contacts outside the Sambisa. It was intended as a final testament, a justification for his life and his impending death. Within hours, it had been leaked to intelligence agencies and media outlets. Analysts parsed every word, looking for clues about his state of mind and his plans. On May 19th, ISWAP commander Boko Gorgori and several other officers approached Shekau's bunker for a final time. They were accompanied by religious scholars who were prepared to debate theology with Shekau if necessary. They were prepared to spend hours or even days negotiating. They hoped that fatigue, hunger, and the certainty of death would break Shekau's resolve. They were wrong. According to multiple accounts from surviving fighters on both sides, the confrontation lasted only minutes. Shekau emerged from the bunker wearing a suicide vest. He was calm. He greeted the ISWAP officers politely. He listened to their appeals. Then he told them that he would never surrender, that he would die before he betrayed the principles he had fought for. He recited verses from the Quran about martyrdom and paradise. As the ISWAP officers moved closer, attempting to disarm him or rush him before he could detonate the vest, Shekau triggered the explosives. The blast was enormous. Shekau was killed instantly, his body torn apart. At least one senior ISWAP officer, standing too close, was killed as well. Several others were wounded by shrapnel. The explosion echoed across the forest, a final exclamation point to a violent life. The manner of Shekau's death was fitting. He had spent his entire career as a jihadist building a cult of personality around his willingness to embrace martyrdom. He had sent thousands of others to their deaths, including children, in suicide attacks. He had preached that death in battle was the highest honor a Muslim could achieve. In the end, he chose the same fate for himself rather than submit. It was the final act of a man who had built an empire of chaos and could not imagine any ending other than destruction. ISWAP forces moved into the bunker immediately after the explosion. They found the bodies of Shekau's loyalists who had chosen to die with him rather than surrender. They secured the site and began documenting what they found: weapons, ammunition, documents, and electronic devices. Over the following days, ISWAP released audio statements confirming Shekau's death. They did not gloat. They presented his death as a necessary act of justice, the end of a chapter that had damaged the jihadist cause in West Africa. Surviving JAS commanders fled to the Mandara Mountains, carrying with them what weapons and supplies they could. Some eventually surrendered to Nigerian authorities. Others joined ISWAP, accepting the very authority that Shekau had died refusing. A hardcore minority, perhaps a few 100 fighters, regrouped under new leadership and vowed to continue Shekau's fight. But without his charisma, without his resources, without the Sambisa as a sanctuary, they were a shadow of what they had been. Shekau's death did not end the insurgency, but it fundamentally altered its dynamics. Within weeks, tens of thousands of fighters and their families began to surrender to Nigerian authorities. They walked out of the forests and the bush, waving white flags, carrying their children, exhausted and traumatized. The surrender sites, hastily established by the military and humanitarian organizations, were overwhelmed. Thousands of people needed food, water, medical care, and shelter. By April 2022, the Nigerian military confirmed that 51,114 members of Boko Haram and its splinter groups had surrendered. The number was staggering. It suggested that a large portion of the insurgency's manpower had been held in the group by fear of Shekau rather than by ideological commitment. Without his iron grip, without the threat of execution for disloyalty, the structure collapsed. Fighters who had been conscripted or coerced saw an opportunity to escape. Families who had been held captive seized the chance to flee. But the mass surrenders created new problems. Where would these people go? Could communities that had suffered under Boko Haram accept their tormentors back? How could the government distinguish between hardcore fighters who had committed atrocities and low-level members who had been forced to participate? What kind of justice was appropriate, and who would administer it? These questions had no easy answers. The Nigerian government established de-radicalization and reintegration programs, but they were underfunded and poorly designed. Surrendered fighters were placed in camps where they received basic vocational training and religious instruction designed to counter the extremist theology they had been taught, but the programs could not address the deep psychological trauma that many participants carried. They could not rebuild the trust that had been shattered between these individuals and their communities. They could not guarantee that former fighters would not return to violence when economic opportunities failed to materialize. Communities that had suffered under Boko Haram were understandably reluctant to accept former fighters back. In some cases, surrendered fighters were attacked or killed when they tried to return to their villages. In other cases, they were shunned and isolated, unable to find work or reintegrate into social life. The government's assurances that these individuals had been rehabilitated carried little weight with people who had lost family members to Boko Haram violence. But not everyone surrendered. A faction of hardcore loyalists refused to accept ISWAP's authority or the Nigerian government's amnesty. They regrouped under Bakura Doro, a commander operating in the marshes and islands of Lake Chad. Doro had been one of Shekau's most trusted lieutenants, a man who shared his uncompromising vision of jihad. His role has been to preserve Shekau's predatory model of warfare in the face of ISWAP's expansion and the Nigerian military's operations. Doro has successfully resisted ISWAP's attempts to absorb his fighters. He launched a counteroffensive in late 2021 and 2022 that reclaimed several islands in Lake Chad that ISWAP had taken during the Sambisa operation. His forces raid fishing communities, seize livestock, and kidnap civilians for ransom. They operate in small, mobile units that strike and disappear before military forces can respond. They have no interest in governance or service provision. They exist to loot and to fight. Doro's success demonstrates that the Shekauist brand of opportunistic violence remains a viable survival strategy in the lawless borderlands of the Lake Chad Basin. It requires fewer resources than ISWAP's governance model. It is simpler to organize and execute. It appeals to a certain type of fighter, men who are more interested in immediate gratification than long-term planning, who prefer the chaos of raiding to the discipline of soldiering. As long as the region remains ungoverned and impoverished, this model will find recruits. The humanitarian toll of Shekau's reign is staggering and still being calculated. The conflict has killed hundreds of thousands of people, though exact figures are impossible to determine. The UN and other organizations estimate that between 300,000 and 400,000 people have died as a direct or indirect result of the insurgency. Millions have been displaced, either within Nigeria or across borders into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Entire towns have been erased from the map. Villages that existed for centuries are now empty ruins. The social fabric of northeastern Nigeria has been torn apart. Schools have been burned, teachers have been killed, and an entire generation of children has grown up without education. Hospitals have been looted and destroyed. Infrastructure that took decades to build has been demolished in days. Markets that were centers of regional trade have been abandoned. The economic cost is incalculable, running into tens of billions of dollars when you account for destroyed property, lost productivity, and the cost of military operations and humanitarian aid. The psychological scars will take generations to heal. Children have witnessed atrocities. Women have been raped and enslaved. Men have been forced to commit acts of violence against their own communities. Trust between ethnic and religious groups has been shattered. The trauma is not just individual, but collective, woven into the fabric of communities that have endured more than a decade of violence. The fate of many victims remains unknown. While some of the Chibok girls have been freed through negotiations or military operations, and others have escaped on their own, dozens remain unaccounted for. Some are believed to have died in captivity, whether through illness, childbirth complications, or in airstrikes that hit insurgent camps. Others are thought to be living in remote areas of the Mandara Mountains or deep in the Sambisa forest, married to commanders, raising children born in captivity. They may not even want to be rescued. After years of indoctrination and adaptation to life in the insurgency, some may no longer identify with their former lives. Efforts to locate them continue, but the chances of success diminish with each passing year. The Nigerian government faces criticism for its handling of the crisis, both in its initial response and in its ongoing efforts. The military's slow reaction to the kidnapping, the mixed messages from officials in the days afterward, and the failure to secure the girls' release through negotiation or rescue have become symbols of state failure for the families of missing girls. The uncertainty is its own form of torture. They do not know if they should mourn or hope. They cannot move forward because the story has no ending. Shekau died the way he lived, in an act of violence that served no purpose beyond asserting his will. He chose destruction over surrender, martyrdom over compromise, annihilation over adaptation. In doing so, he confirmed the central truth of his reign, that absolute power divorced from accountability inevitably devours itself. His empire of chaos could not survive because it was built on a foundation of paranoia and predation, with no mechanism for correction, no room for evolution, no capacity for anything beyond consumption. The man who sent thousands to their deaths, who weaponized children, who burned villages and enslaved women, could not imagine an ending other than his own annihilation. But his death did not bring peace. It brought fragmentation. The insurgency splintered into competing factions, each claiming to represent the true path of jihad, each fighting the others as fiercely as they fight the state. ISWAP continues to control territory, collect taxes, and challenge the Nigerian government's authority across swaths of northeastern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Islands. They have proven more resilient than Shekau's faction because they built institutions that can survive the loss of individual leaders. They govern, however brutally, rather than simply destroy. Bakura Doro's JS faction continues to raid and plunder, operating from hideouts in the lake's marshes and the Mandara Mountains. They represent the purest expression of Shekau's vision: violence as an end in itself, looting as a way of life, terror as a form of governance. They will likely continue until they are destroyed or until they run out of places to hide and people to victimize. The humanitarian crisis persists, with millions still displaced and dependent on aid that is insufficient and uncertain, and the environmental and political conditions that enabled Shekau's rise remain fundamentally unaddressed. Lake Chad continues to shrink, driven by climate patterns that no regional government can control. The Almajiri system continues to produce millions of vulnerable children with no prospects and no protection, a ready-made recruitment pool for any movement that offers them meaning and belonging. Poverty in northern Nigeria remains endemic. Corruption remains systemic. The government remains distant, ineffective, and often predatory. The Nigerian military has had some successes. They have recaptured territory. They have killed or captured many insurgent commanders. They have forced thousands of fighters to surrender. But military operations alone cannot end this conflict because the conflict is not fundamentally military. It is political, economic, and environmental. It is about governance failures, about the absence of opportunity, about populations that have been abandoned by their own state and left vulnerable to anyone who offers an alternative. Breaking the cycle will require political will that has so far been absent. It will require sustained investment in education, infrastructure, and economic development in a region that has been neglected for decades. It will require accountability for abuses committed by all sides, including by security forces whose heavy-handed tactics have often pushed civilians into the arms of insurgents. It will require addressing the Almajiri system, either by reforming it so that these schools actually educate children, or by creating alternatives that give poor families better options. It will require regional cooperation on environmental issues like the management of Lake Chad's water resources. None of these things are happening at the scale required. Nigerian politicians speak of development and reconstruction, but the resources never arrive. Regional summits produce declarations and communiques, but little concrete action. The international community provides humanitarian aid and military assistance, but shows little interest in the harder work of addressing root causes. The easiest path is to treat this as a security problem that can be solved with guns and prisons. The effective path is to treat it as a governance problem that requires rebuilding trust between states and their citizens. The Sambisa Forest, once Shekau's private kingdom, stands as a monument to the cost of failed governance and unchecked violence. It is a place haunted by memory, where thousands suffered and died, where the machinery of terror operated without constraint for years. The forest is being reclaimed by nature, its bunkers collapsing, its paths overgrown. But the suffering it absorbed does not disappear. It radiates outward in the trauma of survivors, in the grief of families, in the fear that still grips communities across the region. What comes next depends not on jihadist commanders hiding in remote forests, but on whether the governments of the Lake Chad Basin can finally provide what they have failed to provide for generations. Security that does not rely on brutality, opportunity that gives young people alternatives to violence, governance that serves citizens rather than exploiting them, and a reason to believe that the future can be different from the past. Until those things exist, the violence will continue to find new forms and new leaders. The names and the tactics will change, but the underlying dynamic will remain. Shekau is dead, but the conditions that created him are alive and thriving. His story is not yet over because it was never just about him. It was about the space that opened up when the state failed, and that space remains unfilled.